Kentucky struggled to become a state full of exciting adventures. Indians used Kentucky as a sacred hunting ground. Many tribes battled here for hunting rights. Surveyors, explorers, and long hunters started moving into Kentucky in the 1600s. Later, families came to farm this land. Kentucky became a bloody battleground between the settlers and the Indians. Eventually, the Indians left this land to these white pioneers, and Kentucky became a state in 1792.
Indians did not live in Kentucky in the 1500s and 1600s. The Shawnee lived in Ohio and Indiana. The Iroquois lived in New York. They were powerful and hostile. Cherokee lived in the mountains of Georgia, North Carolina, and Tennessee.
Kentucky was rich with wildlife, streams, and other plant life. Buffalo and other animals had made paths in search of salt deposits. These paths were called traces.
All of these Indians believed in spirits. They felt like Kentucky was sacred hunting ground.
Kentucky was their hunting grounds. They thought it was given to them by the gods. They would fight for their hunting rights.
1674. The Shawnee Indians captured a man named Gabriel Arthur and brought him into Kentucky. Gabriel escaped and made it back to his home.
In 1679, a French explorer brought an expedition down the Ohio River. The explorer was La Salle.
In 1682, La Salle made a second trip down the Ohio River. This time he went all the way to the mouth of the Mississippi River. La Salle claimed all the land in the Ohio Valley and Mississippi Valley for France. This included Kentucky.
1748, the English felt that Kentucky belonged to them. They had claimed to it in 1609. They sent Major George Washington into the wilderness to warn the French soldiers that Kentucky belonged to the English. Christopher Gish was a scout.
In 1750, Dr. Thomas Walker came to Kentucky to survey land. He was being paid by the Loyal Land Company of Virginia to serve 800,000 acres of land they wanted to sell to settlers. He came through the Cumberland Gap. Dr. Walker built the first shelter in Kentucky. He gave a bad report on Kentucky.
The war, which was to finally end the dispute concerning ownership of Kentucky, was known as the French and Indian War. It began in 1754.
During the French and Indian War, a lot of settlers were killed. The French and the Indians were fighting against the English, but the English won. The French taught the Indians how to scout. For every scalp they brought to the French would give the Indians something like a rifle or some other things.
In 1755, the first white women in Kentucky were Mary Inglis and a Dutch woman. One day they were doing regular chores on their homestead when suddenly they were attacked by Indians. The Indians took them into the wilderness, but in a couple of days they escaped and got lost. When they got hungry, they ate berries off bushes. The Dutch woman ate the wrong kind of berries and went crazy. Mary ran away from the Dutch woman and found her way out of the wilderness. When she got home, she gathered up a search party. She led the search party back from the Dutch woman so they could bring her home.
In 1763, the French and Indian War ended. The English won. They then claimed Kentucky.
The King of England was angry with the colonists. He felt they hadn't helped enough in the war with France. He was trying to punish the colonists. After the French and Indian War in 1763, the King of England made a proclamation. No one could pass the mountains, but Daniel Boone and Squire Boone went past the mountains anyway.
Some men came to be known as long hunters. Long hunters stayed in the wilderness for 2 years or more. Daniel Boone, Squire Boone, John Stewart, and John Finley were long hunters.
John Finley was one of these long hunters. He spent a lot of time in Kentucky's hunting. He told the Boone family a lot of stories about the wilderness. In May 1769, Boone and his brother-in-law, John Stewart, went to Kentucky with Finley. They hunted for more than a year there.
During During this same time, there were men surveying in Kentucky for land companies. Two of these surveyors were Captain Thomas Bullitt and James Harrod.
Simon Kenton came into Kentucky in 1771. Kenton was a long hunter and a scout. He had many adventures in Kentucky's wilderness. Many times he was captured by Indians but managed to escape.
In 1773, Daniel Boone tried to bring some families into Kentucky. As they were going through the Cumberland Gap, the group was attacked. Daniel Boone's son was killed during the attack. Boone wanted to go on, but everyone backed out and went home.
In 1774, James Harrod and his men built Fort Harrod. They built the fort for protection from the Indians. They were surveying the land to be given to the veterans of the French and Indian War.
Fort Harrod had the first school west of the Appalachian Mountains.
The first white baby born in Kentucky was at Fort Harrod.
In 1775, Daniel Boone built Fort Boonesborough in case the Indians should attack. This settlement was named Boonesborough in honor of Daniel Boone. Boone brought his family to the fort when it was completed. His wife Rebecca was the first white woman to come to Kentucky on her own free will.
Many adventures happened at Boonesborough. Daniel Boone's 13-year-old daughter, Jemima, and two friends slipped away from Fort Boonesborough to take a canoe ride. 5 Shawnee braves surprised the girls and took them captive. Jemima left a trail for her father by taking pieces of her petticoat and leaving it on branches and the ground. The girls were saved after 3 days of tracking by Boone and other men from the fort.
After it was built, the fort was attacked by Indians. Daniel was outside to defend the fort. He was shot in the kneecap. Then suddenly an Indian was about to kill Boone. Simon Kenton shot the Indian and Boone was saved.
The first wedding in Kentucky took place at Fort Boonesborough.
Pioneers had 2 ways to come into Kentucky: on foot through the Cumberland Gap on the Wilderness Road, or on a flatboat on the Ohio River.
The pirates and the Indians were dangerous on the river. Drowning because of the rapids, winds, and sandbars were other dangers.
Problems with the King of England got worse. The colonists declared war on the king in 1776. The Revolutionary War began.
During the Revolutionary War, the British soldiers encouraged the Indians to kill Kentucky settlers. The Indians scalped a lot of pioneers during the Revolutionary War. The British soldiers were paying the Indians to scalp the pioneers. It was a very, very, very bloody time.
The Indians kept scalping people and bringing scalps to the British, and the British paid them or gave them guns and weapons.
General Clark first came into Kentucky with James Harrod. The Revolutionary War was going on and Indian attacks. When the war broke out, the settlers found themselves caught without protection from Indian raids. They were backed by the British Army.
General Clark had a plan to stop Indian attacks. He went to Patrick Henry for some money to buy some soldiers to help him stop the British and the Indians. Governor Henry gave General Clark the money. Then Clark went and bought 200 soldiers. They built flatboats and started down the Ohio River. They rafted and rafted until they came to some rapids. They stopped at an island filled with corn. Clark stopped at that island and built a fort and named it Corn Island.
General George Rogers Clark built a fort at Corn Island to train his soldiers. He was going to capture 3 British forts. He went through icy rivers and snow. When he walked into one fort, the British soldiers were all singing and dancing. When Clark walked in, they all stopped what they were doing. Clark did get to capture the 3 British forts, but he didn't get to stop the Indian attacks.
Kentucky was a land of danger and death. A lonely log cabin miles from the nearest neighbor was sometimes ambushed by Indians. Most settlers did not make it through the long struggle. The Indians fought hard to keep Kentucky. Our history is filled with many fallen forts, burned cabins, and massacres. Over 3,000 Kentuckians were killed during raids by Indians. They would break into cabins and torture families. Then they would take their scalps.
On July 17, 1789, a band of Shawnee Indians attacked Fort Chenoweth. 5 settlers were killed. They were killed with bows, arrows, knives, and tomahawks. One of the Kentuckians was burned at the stake with very tall flames. Sparks shot out of the flames and burned the fort down. Mrs. Chenoweth was scalped, but she lived through the fight. It was a very painful, but she lived to tell the story again and again.
In 1792, Kentucky was no longer a county of Virginia. At this time, Isaac Shelby was picked as governor. Kentucky became the 15th state.
The Murder Branch Massacre. It took place in Montgomery County in April of 1793, when a family was captured in the middle of the night. The Indians captured 19 women and children and took them along toward the Ohio River. Later, the party was overtaken by rescuers. But before the women and children could be saved, the Indians killed 12 women. The Indians liked to hurt people before they killed them. They liked to scalp them. Scalping was when they tore the skin and hair off the settler's head.
The last Indian massacre in Kentucky was the Brand Massacre in 1805 near Crittenden in Grant County. Indians attacked the Brand cabin at night and burned it. The Indians scalped Mr. and Mrs. Brand and their children. All except Mrs. Brand died. She crawled to a nearby house.
In December of 1809, Mrs. Crawford rode over 60 miles to Danville on horseback to see Dr. Ephraim McDowell. He operated and removed a large tumor from her stomach. This had never been done before. The tumor was removed. It weighed over 20 pounds. Mrs. Crawford lived to be an old lady.
No pioneer could be without an axe or a rifle. He had to have a rifle to shoot animals and enemies. An axe would be handy to clear the land.
Life in Kentucky was difficult because they did not have stoves, grocery stores, pots, and pans, household needs, and a lot of other things. They had a lot of Indian attacks. They had to make their own soap and candles. They had to raise crops and catch animals in the wilderness. They lived in a one-room cabin. There they had a fireplace that had to heat up the whole room. The fireplace was also used for cooking and for light.
Daniel Boone and Simon Kenton were forced to leave their land. Boone and Kenton had been log hunters. When Kentucky first became a state, there were new laws. One of the laws was to deed your land. Daniel Boone and Simon Kenton didn't know anything about writing deeds. All they knew about was hunting and trapping. They did not write a deed, so they had to leave their land.